First impressions matter, and they matter a lot. And the first impression that your novel makes with the reader is chapter 1. I have spinach in my teeth, don't I? A bad first chapter will leave a bad taste in your reader's mouth, and even the most compelling rest of a novel may not be enough to fully remove that bad taste. So today, let's talk about some bad chapter 1 mistakes that you'll want to avoid. Beginning with not starting with the main character, or at least an important character. There's nothing in writing that you should do 100% of the time, but having chapter 1 follow the main character, or at least one of the characters that the novel is going to be centered around, is almost always a good idea. In the early stages of your novel, you have very little time to get the reader up to speed. We want to introduce them to the characters that they are going to be involved with as soon as possible. If you aren't starting with the main character, at least make it a character that's central to the main plot of the novel. And if you aren't going to do that, then have a compelling reason why. In The Great Gatsby, we don't meet Gatsby until well after chapter 1. But I'm pretty sure he's mentioned, and the aura around Gatsby, his sort of legendary, almost mythical status, is a major theme of that book. So keeping him out of the reader's view early on actually enhances that story, because that's a major theme, that's a major part of the book. If keeping your main character in the shadows beyond chapter 1 doesn't contribute to the theme or the plot of your novel in any meaningful way, then just have them be in the first chapter. Next up, thing number 2 that can lead to a bad first chapter: having too much lingo or lore or technical mumbo jumbo. Fantasy authors, I'm looking at you. Chapter 1 is not the time to overload the reader with a bunch of technical terms or made up magical words that they don't understand the meaning of yet. Athlegar, son of Detraraneus, leader of the clan Masmerianagi, from the lands of the 7 Preslendiers, and bearer of the holy elms of Tetriandria, who must journey across the sea of Multifidus with his loyal Antrelier, glanced towards his father Pestigarius, the 4th carrier of Shinalak's broken hasp key. So many fantasy novels start this way, and it just doesn't work most of the time. Chapter 1 is a time to ease the reader into the story, not beat them over the head with your world building. When it comes to creating that immersive, otherworldly feeling, less is often more. Subtle cues towards world building are usually a better bet than overloading the reader. And this doesn't just apply to fantasy writers. Any sort of expository material that your reader is unlikely to be familiar with can be overwhelming when too much of it is presented in chapter 1. This can apply if you've got some technology, even real-world technology in your novel. It can apply if it's happening in a different religious or cultural setting than most of your readers are familiar with. It can happen if it's in a different time period. There's all sorts of things that can lead to overload if the reader isn't familiar with them. Now, there is a flip side to this that's worth mentioning. Some readers are really into all the technical details of a novel, including potentially world building if it's a fantasy or sci-fi novel. I've never read much Tom Clancy before. His stuff really isn't my cup of tea. This is my cup of tea. But readers who enjoy Tom Clancy also really enjoy things like the bomb bay door opening mechanism of a B-52 being described in excruciating detail. But that's a specific group of readers, and those are readers who have experience with Tom Clancy's novels, so they know what to expect. Readers that are new to you, or readers who are new to a specific genre, may not enjoy that level of technical detail, so you need to be careful with how you present this sort of information throughout your entire novel, but especially in chapter 1. Next up, thing number 4 that can ruin your novel's first chapter: starting with flashbacks or any other thing that warps time in some way. I think there's a lot of scope for writing a novel that isn't entirely linear in how it handles time, which is why this is point 4 when it's supposed to actually be point 3. But chapter 1 is a bad place to do that. Chapter 1 is not the time to mess with time. Time jumping can be confusing for the reader, which is why I put this as point 3 and not point 1. Wait, no, this is point 4. See? Confusing. Flashbacks risk showing events that the reader isn't interested in. If you have a character who's different in the past than they are in the present day, then that can make it harder for the reader to connect with the character because you're kind of presenting two different versions of the character. Also, anytime you move through time, it takes page space to explain that to the reader. That's page space that isn't doing important things like building up emotional engagement or making the reader curious about the setting or the characters. Threading the needle to get a reader through chapter 1 is so challenging that you want to remove anything that makes it more complicated than it needs to be. And messing around with time can make things complicated. Next up, thing number 4 that can ruin the first chapter of your novel: introducing too many characters. I think you need to go. If you have a large cast, introducing the reader to all of them in chapter 1 is probably not a great idea. For one thing, if you have a scene with, 15 named characters in it, that's going to be confusing. As the reader becomes more familiar with your characters, they will be able to handle more named characters in a scene. But early on, when everything's new and they're not familiar with anything, it can be really confusing, really overwhelming. The Hobbit famously begins with kind of one of these overwhelming introductions to a bunch of characters and a bunch of stuff going on. But the whole point of that first chapter in The Hobbit is to be confusing and overwhelming. That's the intent. Yes, it introduces a ton of characters, but that's what's meant to happen. If you're just going around a room introducing characters and dumping a bit of characterization because you just want to get all the character introductions out of the way in chapter 1, that's going to end up being a really boring way to start a novel. If you have no compelling reason beyond, I just need to introduce these characters so I can start the actual story, it's just kind of a lazy way to do that. The reader is likely going to forget all those characters almost immediately, and you're going to suck time away from doing something compelling in your introductory chapter. Also remember that the more characters you introduce, the less depth you can go into on any single one of them, which means you will have a higher number of flatter characters, which probably isn't going to be as interesting. And lastly, thing number 5 that can ruin your first chapter: not having a first chapter that makes the reader want to read the second chapter. There are a whole bunch of things you need to accomplish in chapter 1, but when you boil these right down, chapter 1 is supposed to make the reader want to read chapter 2. Any chapter 1 that does anything that makes the reader want to read chapter 2 has done its job. The other stuff I talked about today are things that I think make that job harder to do. But if your chapter 1 does one of the things we talked about today, and most of the people who read it still want to read chapter 2, then it's arguably a good chapter 1. Now, there are a few different ways to approach this. You can have a cliffhanger where the character is put into some kind of peril and their fate isn't revealed until chapter 2. This can be tricky because unless the reader already has an emotional connection with the character, they may not be engaged with the peril that you put the character in. They may simply not care. Intrigue or curiosity is, in my opinion at least, a far easier way to do this. If you present a conflict or some other compelling question at the outset, the reader will want to continue reading. Joe Abercrombie's Best Served Cold ends chapter 1 with a character being thrown off a cliff. So not technically a cliffhanger because they're not hanging off the cliff, but definitely a compelling conflict that the character needs to solve, and the reader will be interested in knowing how that conflict gets solved. Ultimately, chapter 1 needs to get the reader to chapter 2. Trying to do much beyond that is usually just a waste. I've done this. Lots of beginners start out doing this where they put way too much emphasis in trying to make chapter 1 amazing. They try to tell the whole story to get all the emotion and characters and world building all across in one magnificent scene. The reality is you don't need to do that. Your first chapter just needs to be good enough to get the reader to chapter 2. Yes, there needs to be something compelling. Yes, you need to introduce a character. Yes, it's difficult to do all of these things, but in a sense, I think most writers can do less in chapter 1 than they think they need to. Speaking of doing less things, I'm about to do less talking because this video is almost over. So there you have it. I'd love to hear what you think about this video, especially the first part of it, in the comments down below. Please check out all my other writing advice related videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.